Someone disrespects you, cuts you off mid-sentence, talks down to you in front of others, dismisses something you worked hard on like it was nothing. And in that moment, something in you wants to react. Immediately, forcefully, to prove them wrong, to defend yourself, to make sure they know they can't treat you that way. That reaction feels justified. It feels necessary. But here's what almost nobody tells you. The way you react in that moment says far more about you than their disrespect ever will. The Stoics understood something about this 2,000 years ago that most people still haven't learned today. That how you respond to disrespect is not just a reaction, it's a choice. And that choice reveals, more clearly than almost anything else, who you actually are underneath the pressure. Today, we're going to explore what Stoic philosophy teaches about handling disrespect, not by suppressing your feelings. Not by becoming a doormat, but by responding from a place of strength so complete that you never need to prove it to anyone. Because there's a difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is what happens when someone else controls your behavior. Responding is what happens when you remain in control, regardless of what they do. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how to tell the difference, and how to make sure that the next time someone disrespects you, you walk away stronger, not smaller. If this speaks to you, hit subscribe. It helps this reach more people who need it. Let's get into it. Have you ever watched someone lose their temper in response to a small insult? And immediately thought less of them, not because of what was said to them, but because of how they responded? That instinct is worth paying attention to, because it reveals something important about how disrespect actually works. When someone insults you and you react with immediate anger, loud defense, or visible distress, you've handed them something valuable, proof that their words had power over you. The bigger your reaction, the more control you've given away. The Stoics understood this completely. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." Notice what he's not saying. He's not saying to ignore disrespect, or pretend it doesn't happen. He's pointing at something sharper, that the most powerful response to someone trying to provoke you is to remain exactly who you already are. Unmoved, unchanged by their attempt to control your reaction. Think about someone insulting a person who is genuinely secure in themselves. The insult often lands strangely, because the person doesn't react the way the insulter expected. There's no visible wound to point to. No dramatic response to feel satisfied by. And that absence of reaction is, in itself, one of the most powerful responses available. Compare that to someone who explodes at the smallest provocation. Even if their anger is understandable, even if the disrespect was genuinely unfair, the loud reaction often costs them more than the original insult did. It confirms, publicly, that they can be provoked, that their composure has a price, that pushing the right button gets a predictable result. Have you ever regretted a reaction more than the thing that triggered it? That's usually a sign that the reaction cost you more than the original offense ever did. Epictetus taught his students that other people's insults are, in a real sense, information about them, not verdicts about you. Someone's disrespect reveals their own state of mind, their own insecurities, their own lack of self-control. It doesn't actually change who you are, unless you let your reaction confirm their narrative. So how do you practice this? First, when disrespect happens, create space before responding. Even a few seconds of silence changes everything. That pause alone often disarms the other person more than any words could. Second, ask yourself, does this reaction make me look more like the person I want to be? Or less? Often, the answer becomes obvious the moment you actually pause to ask it. And finally, remember that your composure is not weakness. It's the clearest evidence of strength you can offer, stronger than any comeback, any raised voice, any dramatic defense could ever be. Number 2. Here's a question worth sitting with honestly. When someone disrespects you and you say nothing, what does your silence actually communicate? Most people assume silence in the face of disrespect means weakness. But the Stoics drew a sharper distinction between silence that comes from fear and silence that comes from choice. Epictetus taught that we are not always obligated to respond to every provocation. He said, "It is the act of an ill-instructed man to blame others for his own bad condition." In other words, someone's disrespect is their own failure of character, not automatically your responsibility to correct or address. But here's the nuance that matters. There's a real difference between choosing not to engage with someone's disrespect because you've decided it's beneath your energy, and staying silent because you're afraid of the confrontation that speaking up might create. The first is stoic strength. The second is simply avoidance wearing the costume of composure. Think about a moment when you stayed quiet in response to disrespect. Was it because you genuinely decided the moment didn't deserve your energy? Or was it because you were afraid of what might happen if you spoke up? Those two silences look identical from the outside, but they feel completely different on the inside, and they have completely different effects on your own self-respect over time. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the importance of acting according to your own reasoned judgment, rather than simply reacting to what others expect of you. Sometimes that judgment says, "This moment deserves a direct, clear response." Sometimes it says, "This moment deserves nothing at all," because engaging would only give it more weight than it's earned. The key is that the choice needs to actually be yours, made deliberately, not defaulted into out of fear. Consider someone who is disrespected repeatedly by the same person, in the same way, and continues saying nothing each time, not because they've decided the behavior doesn't matter, but because confrontation feels too uncomfortable to risk. Over time, that pattern of avoidance tends to erode self-respect far more than a single difficult confrontation ever would. So how do you tell the difference in your own life? First, when you choose not to respond to disrespect, ask yourself honestly whether that choice comes from genuine indifference or from fear. Only you know the real answer. Second, if the same disrespect keeps happening from the same source, notice that pattern. Repeated disrespect that goes unaddressed often isn't being ignored strategically. It's often simply being tolerated out of discomfort with confrontation. And finally, remember that addressing disrespect directly, calmly, and clearly is not the opposite of stoic composure. It's often the most composed response available, far more composed than the silent resentment that builds when something keeps happening and is never actually addressed. Number 3. When someone disrespects you, there's often a strong pull to explain yourself extensively, to justify, to defend, to make absolutely sure they understand why their treatment of you is wrong. The Stoics taught something almost opposite. Epictetus said, "If you wish to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." He wasn't suggesting you shouldn't care what people think. He was pointing at something more specific, that the need for everyone to fully understand and validate your position is often more about your own insecurity than about the actual situation requiring extensive explanation. Think about the most powerful responses to disrespect you've ever witnessed. Chances are, they weren't long, elaborate defenses. They were short, clear, direct, and precisely because of that brevity, they carried far more weight than a lengthy explanation ever could have. There's a particular kind of strength in saying exactly what needs to be said, and nothing more, not because you don't have more to say, but because you've recognized that over-explaining often signals insecurity rather than confidence. A person who is genuinely secure doesn't need the other person to fully agree with their position in order to feel at peace with it. Marcus Aurelius practiced a version of this discipline constantly. Given his position as emperor, he couldn't respond to every provocation, every political maneuver, every disrespectful challenge with extensive engagement. He had to choose his responses carefully, briefly, and then move forward without needing every interaction fully resolved to his satisfaction. Consider the difference between saying, briefly and calmly, "That wasn't okay," and launching into a 5-minute explanation of exactly why it wasn't okay. Citing every relevant detail, anticipating every counter-argument, the first response often lands with more weight, precisely because it doesn't over-explain itself into looking uncertain. Have you noticed that people who are genuinely confident rarely feel the need to over-justify their boundaries? They state them, once, clearly, and then let the statement stand on its own, without needing extensive backup to feel secure in it. So how do you practice this? First, the next time you need to address disrespect, prepare what you actually need to say, and then deliberately keep it shorter than your instinct suggests. Brevity often communicates more confidence than length ever could. Second, resist the urge to over-explain your position in the hope that the other person will fully agree with you. You don't need their agreement in order for your boundary to be valid. And finally, practice saying what you mean once, clearly, and then letting it stand, rather than repeating or expanding it multiple times in an attempt to make sure it lands. If it was clear the first time, repetition often weakens it rather than strengthening it. Number 4. One of the most exhausting aspects of dealing with disrespect is the fear of what other people will think if you don't respond forcefully enough. The worry that staying calm will be mistaken for weakness. That not defending yourself loudly will be read as agreement with whatever was said. Epictetus had a direct teaching about this exact fear. He taught that other people's opinions of you are not within your control, and therefore not worth the enormous energy most of us spend trying to manage them. He said, "If anyone tells you that a certain person speaks ill of you, do not make excuses about what is said of you, but answer, 'He was ignorant of my other faults, else he would not have mentioned these alone.'" There's a kind of dark humor in that response, but underneath it is something genuinely useful, a recognition that you cannot control how you are perceived. No matter how skillfully you manage every interaction, someone determined to see you a certain way will find evidence for that view regardless of how you actually behave. This means chasing a particular reputation, trying to control exactly how everyone perceives you, especially in moments of conflict, is ultimately a losing game. Not because reputation doesn't matter at all, but because you cannot fully control it no matter how much energy you invest in managing it. Think about how much energy goes into imagining what witnesses to a disrespectful interaction might be thinking. Are they judging you for not responding forcefully enough? Are they thinking less of you for staying calm? Most of that imagined judgment exists only in your own head, and even the judgment that is real, from actual people, is largely outside your control regardless of how you respond. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the freedom available once you stop needing universal approval for your actions. He understood that even as emperor, with enormous visibility and scrutiny, he could not control how every observer interpreted his choices. What he could control was whether his choices aligned with his own reasoned judgment about what was right. Consider redirecting the energy you'd spend managing others' perceptions towards simply acting in alignment with your own values. That energy is far better spent, and it's actually within your control, unlike the opinions of witnesses you'll likely never think about again by next week. So how do you practice this? First, notice when you're making a decision based on how it will look to observers, rather than based on what actually feels right to you. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem. Second, remind yourself that most witnesses to a disrespectful interaction are far less invested in judging your response than your anxious mind assumes. People are usually more focused on their own concerns than on evaluating your composure. And finally, let your own internal standard, not the imagined opinions of onlookers, be the measure of whether you handled a situation well. Number 5. There's a difference between setting a boundary and needing the other person to respect it immediately, fully, and without further testing. Many of us, after finally working up the courage to address disrespect directly, expect the situation to resolve completely in that single interaction. The other person apologizes, changes their behavior, and the discomfort ends there. But real life rarely works that cleanly. The Stoics taught a more realistic and, ultimately, more peaceful approach. You are responsible for stating your boundary clearly. You are not responsible for controlling how the other person receives it, whether they respect it, or how long it takes them to adjust their behavior, if they adjust it at all. Epictetus's dichotomy of control applies directly here. Your action, stating the boundary clearly and calmly, is within your control. Their response, respecting it, dismissing it, testing it again later, is not. This distinction matters because expecting immediate, complete resolution after setting a boundary often sets you up for frustration. The other person may need to test the boundary again before fully accepting it. They may not accept it at all. Neither outcome means you failed to communicate clearly. It simply means their response was never fully within your control to begin with. Think about setting a boundary with someone who has a long-established pattern of disrespect. The first time you address it clearly, they might apologize and mean it, or they might dismiss it, or even escalate briefly, testing whether you'll actually hold the boundary or eventually back down. The Stoic approach here is steady repetition, without escalating frustration each time the boundary needs restating. You state it clearly, you let it rest. If it's crossed again, you address it again, calmly, without needing this particular instance to be the one that finally resolves everything permanently. Marcus Aurelius, dealing with political rivals and difficult relationships throughout his reign, understood that consistency over time, rather than a single perfect confrontation, was what actually shaped outcomes. He didn't expect every difficult person to transform after one conversation. He simply remained consistent in his own conduct, interaction after interaction, regardless of how quickly or slowly others adjusted. So how do you practice this? First, when you set a boundary, release the expectation that it needs to resolve everything in that single moment. Boundaries are often tested more than once before they're fully respected. Second, remain calm and consistent if the boundary needs restating. Increased frustration each time doesn't make the boundary more effective, it often makes it look more reactive, which can actually undermine its authority. And finally, trust that your consistency, over time, communicates more than any single dramatic confrontation ever could. Patterns shift gradually, through repeated clarity, not through one perfect conversation. Number 6. Not every instance of disrespect requires a response. This is, for many people, one of the hardest Stoic teachings to actually accept, because it can feel, at first, like it's condoning bad behavior by letting it pass without comment. But Epictetus taught something more nuanced. He suggested that wisdom includes discernment about which battles genuinely deserve your energy, and which ones cost more than they're worth to engage with at all. He said, "Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are." Applied here, this means accepting that not every disrespectful comment, every rude stranger, every minor slight requires your engagement in order for you to remain at peace. Think about the difference between a stranger's rude comment and a passing interaction you'll never think about again, and a pattern of disrespect from someone who remains significant in your daily life. Both are technically disrespect, but the energy required to engage with each one meaningfully is completely different. And treating them identically often means either overreacting to minor moments or underreacting to significant patterns. The Stoic skill here is discernment, learning to quickly assess whether a given moment of disrespect actually warrants a response, or whether it's more efficiently handled by simply letting it pass, unaddressed, without any cost to your own self-respect. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about not wasting energy on things beneath his position, beneath his actual concern, not out of arrogance, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that his energy was finite and needed to be directed toward what actually mattered. Consider a rude comment from someone you'll interact with once and never see again. Engaging fully with that moment, feeling wounded by it, replaying it, needing to respond forcefully, often costs you far more energy than the moment itself actually deserves. Letting it pass isn't weakness. It's often simply an accurate assessment that this particular battle isn't worth fighting. Compare that to a colleague who disrespects you repeatedly in a professional setting you're part of daily. That pattern genuinely warrants direct address, because the cost of letting it continue unaddressed compounds significantly over time, unlike a single passing interaction with a stranger. So how do you practice this discernment? First, before reacting to disrespect, quickly assess the actual stakes. Is this a pattern that affects your ongoing life, or a passing moment that will have zero relevance by tomorrow? Second, give yourself permission to let minor, low-stakes disrespect pass without needing to address every single instance. That's not weakness, it's efficient allocation of energy that actually matters. And finally, reserve your direct, clear responses for situations that genuinely warrant them, patterns, relationships that matter, repeated behavior that affects your actual life, rather than every single passing slight. Number 7. There's an important difference between responding to disrespect from a place of genuine values and responding purely from the sting of being hurt. When disrespect happens, the immediate feeling is often wounded pride, a sharp, personal sense of having been diminished, and responses that come purely from that wound tend to be defensive, reactive, focused entirely on restoring the ego rather than on anything more substantial. The Stoics taught a different foundation for response. Marcus Aurelius wrote about acting always from reasoned judgment about what's right, rather than from immediate emotional reaction. This doesn't mean suppressing the sting of being disrespected, that sting is a natural human response. but it means not letting that sting be the sole driver of how you respond. Think about the difference between someone who responds to disrespect by trying to make the other person feel equally small, a response driven purely by wounded pride seeking restoration, versus someone who responds by calmly stating what was inappropriate about the behavior, grounded in a genuine value around mutual respect, rather than in a need to win or wound in return. The first response often escalates the situation, because it's fundamentally about restoring ego rather than addressing the actual issue. The second response, grounded in values rather than wounds, tends to de-escalate, because it's not seeking to inflict equivalent pain, it's simply stating a clear standard. Epictetus taught that dignity comes not from defeating those who disrespect you, but from maintaining your own principles regardless of how others behave. This is a genuinely different foundation for response than the instinct to wound in return. Have you noticed that responses driven by wounded pride, even when they feel satisfying in the moment, often leave a lingering discomfort afterward, a sense that something wasn't quite right about how you handled it? That discomfort is often a signal that the response came more from the wound than from your actual values. Consider, the next time disrespect happens, pausing long enough to identify which is driving your response, the sting of the moment, or your genuine values about how people should treat each other. Both might lead to similar words, but they tend to produce very different energy, and very different long-term satisfaction with how you handled the situation. So how do you practice this distinction? First, when disrespect happens, notice the initial wounded reaction without immediately acting on it. Let there be a gap between the sting and your response. Second, ask yourself what value is actually at stake: respect, honesty, fairness, rather than focusing purely on how the moment made you personally feel. And finally, let your response be an expression of that value, rather than purely an attempt to restore your wounded pride. The two might look similar from the outside, but they feel entirely different from the inside, and often produce very different outcomes. Number 8. Throughout everything we've discussed today, there's an important distinction worth making clear before we close. Stoic composure in the face of disrespect does not mean becoming numb, suppressing every emotional response, or pretending disrespect doesn't genuinely hurt sometimes. That's not Stoicism. That's just emotional suppression wearing philosophical language. Marcus Aurelius, despite everything he wrote about composure and reasoned response, was still a human being who felt hurt, frustration, and anger, just like anyone else. The discipline wasn't in eliminating those feelings. It was in not letting those feelings dictate his behavior without his conscious choice in the matter. This distinction matters enormously. Unshakable, in the Stoic sense, doesn't mean unfeeling. It means feeling fully, while still maintaining enough internal steadiness that your actions remain aligned with your values, rather than purely reactive to whatever emotion is present in the moment. Think about someone who has genuinely internalized Stoic composure. They still feel the sting of disrespect. They still notice the emotional response arising, but they've built enough internal space between that feeling and their action that they can choose their response deliberately, rather than being swept along by the emotion automatically. This is a lifelong practice, not a destination you arrive at once and maintain perfectly forever. Even the most composed people still have moments where disrespect genuinely rattles them, where the old automatic reaction almost takes over before they catch it. Epictetus taught his students that progress in this practice is measured not by never feeling disturbed, but by noticing disturbance more quickly, and returning to steadiness more efficiently. Each time, not perfection, progress. Consider your own relationship with disrespect right now. Perhaps you already have moments of genuine composure, and moments where the old reactive pattern still takes hold. Both are part of the same ongoing practice, not evidence of failure, but simply where you currently are in a lifelong discipline that even Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself for decades, never claimed to have fully mastered. So here's what to carry forward from everything we've discussed today. First, remember that composure is not suppression. Feel what you feel, fully and honestly. The discipline is in the gap between feeling and action, not in eliminating the feeling altogether. Second, practice the pause. Every single time disrespect happens, even in small moments, that pause is where the entire practice actually lives, more than in any specific response strategy. And finally, Be patient with yourself when the old reactive pattern occasionally wins. That's not failure. That's simply evidence that you're human, practicing something genuinely difficult, the same way people have been practicing it for 2,000 years. With the same mixture of progress and occasional setback. The goal was never to become someone who cannot be disrespected. It was to become someone who, regardless of how they're treated, remains fundamentally in control of who they choose to be in response. That choice, more than any comeback, any boundary, any perfectly composed response, is where your actual strength lives. Disrespect will keep happening. That's simply part of being human, moving through a world full of other imperfect human beings. But how you respond to it, that remains entirely yours to shape. Practice and refine, one interaction at a time. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus each faced disrespect in forms far more serious than most of us will ever encounter: political betrayal, enslavement, public humiliation, and each of them arrived at the same conclusion: your power was never in controlling how others treat you. It was always in controlling who you remain, regardless of how they choose to behave. If this gave you something useful to carry forward, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. We release new Stoic philosophy content every week, built to give you real tools for real situations. And in the comments, tell me about a time you handled disrespect the way you wish you had. I'd genuinely like to hear it. Until next time, stay steady. That's the whole practice.